Hey now, it's Mike Gilbert, host of the Mike and JD Show, right here on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. Join JD by God Oliva and myself every Thursday night live on the Voices of Wrestling YouTube channel at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we stay up all night discussing all the hottest stories in professional wrestling. You can also check us out right here on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting feed, or you can subscribe to the Mike and JD Show feed. Now, enjoy the show.
Check engine light on? Take the guesswork out of your check engine light with O'Reilly Veriscan. It's free. Ask for O'Reilly Veriscan today.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
This podcast is a member of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. Visit voicesofwrestling.com to hear the rest of our great podcasts, as well as show reviews, columns, opinions, and updates across the world of wrestling.
Welcome back to Those Days, a retrospective on Michinoku Pro. Episode 2, The Collapse of Universal. Those Days is a project of Open the Voice Gate and the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network. You could find us on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network feed or on the dedicated Open the Voice Gate feed, anywhere you get your podcasts. You can follow us on social media at Open Voice Gate. If you'd like to donate to the show, click the link in the show notes. It'll take you to our redcircle.com landing site. You click the red box that says sponsor this podcast, and you can set up a one-time or recurring donation. No obligation whatsoever, but we would like to thank all of our previous donors. I am one of your hosts, your old pal, Mike Spears, joined alongside your other host, Case Lowe. In Case, last episode, we laid out the story of how one young great Sasuke went from a small town of Morioka, Iwate, Japan, to Tokyo to start his pro wrestling dream, and how that led to him starting Michinoku Pro Wrestling in 1993. But there's other parts to this overall genesis of Michinoku Pro that we have to talk about today, and a lot of that is the collapse of the Universal Wrestling Federation, or Hamada's Universal, as it's more commonly called in the West.
Yeah, when we last talked, we left off reviewing the first two Michinoku Pro shows, one of which exists entirely as a handheld, that being the debut show, and the other of which existing, partially on an older episode of Michinoku Pro TV where they aired two matches, but the full show that was remastered on Nico Nico a few years ago. We have the links to both those in the Open the Voice Gate channel on the Voices of Wrestling Discord. But when we last left off, we're coming off of these two shows that I think you and I both found to be quite exciting, and maybe even a level up in terms of consistency and depth on the roster from, say, the beginning of Toryumon that would happen 6 years after Michinoku Pro launch. So a very interesting time. You also have the establishment of Super Delphin as your lead heel. And the last note that we had before we said goodbye last week was that not only was Super Delphin going to be your lead heel, but Mongolian Yuga, who will be Jinsei Shinzaki going forward, and Wally Yamaguchi, the heel manager / referee, had joined up alongside Delphin. And we had a bit of a heel trio unfold very early on in the days of Michinoku Pro, with their main target, of course, being the Great Sasuke.
Yeah, and I feel like the story of the March 16th show in Yahaba and the March 17th show in Niohei ends up being the what at this time is kind of considered the Sasuke army, which is essentially the remainder of the roster versus this new what becomes known as Dolphin Corps. And from that real moment, we see, at least as Michinoku Pro gets going, you have your first kind of headline feud coming out of those shows. And really what you start to see as we move into the spring and then their April tour, and then much later when they start getting involved with other promotions, we did not see as much development necessarily from the rest of the roster on those first two shows. But this week, as we are going to go through the May through August 24th shows for Michinoku Pro, we're going to start getting a more well fleshed out roster real soon, and that's going to be a lot of what we kind of talk about today as we get through after we talk about the news and the events and we get to the shows themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm glad you brought that up. That I think by the end of the footage that we watched for this episode, and for those that are maybe looking to pause here, watch everything that we talk about, and then come back, what we're going to be talking about today is the Michinoku Pro appearance on the May 5th, 1993 FMW Kawasaki Stadium show, the Michinoku Pro airing on June 19th, 93, the Michinoku Pro show on July 24th, 1993, the Michinoku Pro offer match on the Kobe Baseball Stadium show from FMW on August 22nd, 1993, and the Michinoku Pro Studio TV taping that took place just a few days later, August 24th, 1993. We want to obviously start where we left off, but we'll end there because not only do we get a big Sasuke versus Delphin singles match in July, but we get the rematch in August, and it feels like that's a perfect stopping point for today's episode. But certainly by the end of that August taping, it felt like we actually had a roster to really play with from top to bottom. Mike, of course, as I said last week, this is not a Universal Pro Wrestling podcast. We are not going to sit here and break down matches from Hamada's Universal. We're not going to do full show reviews for that. But the collapse of Hamada's Universal plays directly into the success of Michinoku Pro Wrestling. And with that in mind, are you ready to jump into the timeline for this week?
Absolutely. Before we get into the timeline, one thing that we should note as we start, Michinoku Pro was not split from Universal in March of 1993. So when we're talking about people appearing on these Universal shows, essentially the native roster of Universal has moved over to Michinoku Pro, but at least through this moment, they are also still working Hamada's Universal.
It was essentially a thing where by this point, Sasuke was considered to have been running the Tohoku branch of Universal Pro Wrestling, and Universal still very much existed. And, you would even see in the earliest Michinoku Pro footage on Gaora on Champ Forum, and we talked about Champ Forum last week and what that show was and how it came to be. It was part Universal at Cork and Hall, and then they would show you a Michinoku Pro match or two. It was a promotion, two promotions that had synergy, if you want to use a corporate buzzword, Mike, two promotions that had synergy. But of course, we have to talk about the downfall of Universal if we're going to talk about the success of Michinoku Pro.
Absolutely. If you're looking for a little bit of a modern day equivalent, not completely the same, but in the year 2005, or 25, the situation between 01, Real 01, Tochiki Pro, not dissimilar to what Universal was in April of 1993.
Gross.
Hey, I'm just trying to pull some things for like modern analogies in case people might not have all of the frame of reference here.
No, it's fair. It's just disgusting to think about. But anyways, as we get into the timeline, we jump into April of 1993 with Universal Pro Wrestling continuing to run shows. Michinoku Pro, they start March 16th, 1993 and run essentially their first tour through the end of March. And then in April, Universal comes back. And these are lame duck shows. There's just nothing historical that happens on these shows. There's nothing in particularly great that happens on these shows. But there is a note from the 416 show in Hakata that Dave Meltzer writes about in the April 23rd, 1993 Wrestling Observer newsletter that I do think is worth reading, where Dave says, American rules are starting to take effect in the smaller groups in Japan, as on April 16th in Hakata, Super Delphin defended the UWF Super welterweight belt against Great Sasuke. Sasuke won via countout, and the crowd thought it was a title change, but it was announced that due to the countout, the title didn't change. In Mexico and Japan, since time began, titles change via DQ or countout finish unless they were an American-based title, in which case the American rules are in effect. And then Dave says in parentheses, they were in an angle regarding that in the early 80s when Nick Bockwinkel was DQ'd in an AWA title match against Jumbo Tsuruta, and the crowd all thought that the title had changed because up to that point, it had always been via DQ, but since it was an American title, it was ruled differently. And there's no larger point here, as that is the end of the recap from the April 23rd, 1993 Wrestling Observer newsletter. There's no larger point here other than to say that we are really seeing a changing of the guard in Japanese wrestling at this point. Now, of course, I think the reason that that most of, 90s Japanese wrestling is remembered as fondly as it is not only, of course, just the all-time great matches, but it was still something that felt far more distinct than what you were seeing in America, whereas in 2025, I think those lines are blurred a little bit more than people like you or I would like. I think ideally Japan would still look way different than America, which would still look way different than Mexico. And I don't love the global style that is starting to take a stranglehold of wrestling in general. But it is worth noting that, hey, between Universal and Michinoku Pro here, they are making headlines for having a completely different school of thought than All Japan and New Japan before them had.
Right. And when you look at kind of the innovations within Japanese pro wrestling and the schools of thought, this was not just a groundswell of change. This was a lot in a series of changes that I think you would see, that you would classify, starting with the Universal Wrestling Federation, UWFI, introducing their rule set as a change and somewhat innovation in pro wrestling in the 80s, moving through to frontier martial arts wrestling with death matches, and how you would also see Big Japan and IWA kind of lump themselves in here. But what we kind of see here, and uniquely with what's happening in Hamada's Universal and Michinoku Pro case, I think that the big change here, and I think it's kind of interesting that it's happening this late, and we will talk about like these changes, especially as it's kind of exemplified over these 4 months we're going to take everyone through on this episode, is you're really starting to see with some of these changes and the wrestling that comes about in the spring and summer of 1993, the strong influence of territory wrestling. And if from what we talked about in our first episode, that lends me to believe that a lot of these kind of innovations come from someone like Wally Yamaguchi.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's, we'll talk about it later, but Wally's full on credited with booking Michinoku Pro in the early days, and I know Dr. Lucha has said on record that he is responsible for the Sato versus Super Delphin feud that we'll start to cover in the next episode. But you're talking about Wally Yamaguchi, a guy who is at this point completely connected to all aspects of the American wrestling world, and he starts to get a little bit of power, obviously in Universal, but especially in Michinoku Pro, and you start to see that come to fruition. Now, the thing that happens here as we get into April of 1993 is, one, Universal, I referenced that show in Hakata being on April 16th. This plays into the last episode. That Universal tour was April 9th through April 16th. And as we talked about last time, the native wrestlers, the Japanese wrestlers that were wrestling for Universal, were not getting paid. And obviously, wrestlers on per-date appearances, which all these guys would have been, they can't get paid if they aren't running shows. And it's worth noting again, Universal just did not run a lot of shows, especially post-1991. These tours would get shorter and shorter. The Mexican wrestlers that were being flown in would get paid, but the Japanese wrestlers were not getting paid. And one of the things that Sasuke wanted to do with Michinoku Pro was run a bunch of shows so guys can get paid. So Universal runs from April 9th through April 16th, and then Michinoku Pro picks up from there with shows beginning on April 19th. And I would say, and Mike, you correct me if I'm wrong here, and I'll read the passage in just a second, but I think one of the most important things in Michinoku Pro Wrestling history, at least in terms of the ethos of this promotion, happens on April 22nd, 1993.
That's right. And I think that when we talk about Daito Morioka and the show that happens on April 22nd, we have to also at the same time talk about how everything really was for Michinoku Pro leading up to this show. It was a overwhelming success in Yahaba, but after that show, as the tour went around, it was dwindling and dwindling ticket sales. And of course, we will hammer this point home on many episodes. Sasuke, when he conceptualized Michinoku Pro, he did it in such a manner that, at least with the way that he was going to want to present wrestling to the Tohoku region, all he needed was 500 tickets sold, because he cut costs where he could. There were no pads on the outside. They would do all the promotion themselves, but they felt like 500 was the nice round number, that if we sell this much, and this is kind of how these shows go will end up being okay, and everyone will get paid and there won't be any issues. But the issues that started happening with Michinoku Pro and this April tour is that they would have a couple really strong dates, including 720 listed on the 19th in Takizawa, and 880 listed in Honora on April 24th or April 21st. But the shows that did not sell, they did not sell well at all. You had a lot of houses on that first tour to be at about 200, 300, but then you would have the show that comes up on April 22nd in Daito that is a whole nother issue and becomes really one of many last stands and rallying cries for this nascent promotion.
And so Sasuke writes in his book, the one we referenced constantly in the last episode. This is Sasuke Soars from 1995. This was translated by Brett, the FMW historian, and thank goodness he did that, because it has been such a valuable guide as we talk about the formation of Michinoku Pro Wrestling. Sasuke says in his book about this April 22nd show, "We entered the venue around 5 o'clock on the day, but there was not a single soul around the gymnasium. That's strange, I thought, and I checked the ticket sales, only to find that there were not even 10 tickets sold. This is bad, I thought. For a moment, my spine shivered. I immediately ordered the young wrestlers to drive the advertising car, but our efforts were in vain and only 85 people attended that day. Looking around the venue through the curtains from behind the waiting room, I saw that it was completely empty. This is not good. I felt hopeless as I looked at the deserted venue. Moreover, the attendance for the April series was far below the target of 500 at every venue." So just to interject here, Mike, even those attendance numbers that we have that are on record listed as sellouts of maybe 700 fans, Sasuke is here saying the opposite in his book, which I think is important to note. So Sasuke says again that the April series was far below the target of 500 fans in every venue. Was Michinoku Pro just a dream after all? Was local pro wrestling impossible in Japan? I felt so helpless. When I returned to the waiting room, the faces of the wrestlers were still gloomy. It seemed as if the deserted atmosphere of the venue was being transmitted directly to the wrestlers. I also lost my energy after seeing the empty venue, so I told Hamada-san, the oldest of the wrestlers, "Mr. Hamada, there are only 85 people in attendance today. Let's finish the match early and go home." The wrestlers around him responded, "I agree. Let's close up shop early today." Then Mr. Hamada suddenly turned grim and yelled, "You idiots. You guys have to work even harder at times like this. Hustle harder than usual and give it your all in the match. Give it your all. It's out of the question to slack off at a time like this, because if you take away that pride from us wrestlers, what will we have left?" The gloomy atmosphere in the waiting room was instantly filled with tension. "I'll fight with all my might, even if there's only one spectator. That's the pride of a professional wrestler. We're always fighting with our lives on the line. It doesn't matter how many spectators there are. Even if there are a few spectators, professionals are the ones who risk their lives. That's why I'm going to fight with all my might today, too." And then Sasuke notes, hearing Hamada's words, everyone woke up in a start. And I would go as far to say this is one of the most important moments in the history of Michinoku Pro. And it also might have led to their downfall, because there are times as we get into 95 and 96 and 97 when wrestlers in this promotion start becoming somewhat of a global enterprise that they desperately need to slow down, and Sasuke in particular being the most guilty party of all. And yet it seems like the story of Sasuke's career is that this guy could never slow down. Now, of course, it also builds in this ethos that leads to the rise of Michinoku Pro in the first place, but a real tale of two sides here.
Yeah, and especially when you talk about how Michinoku Pro arrived at that 500 ticket mark case, you're already having a situation that Sasuke talks about, that he was essentially loaned the money by his family, and he's operating out of a shed on his parents' property. The advertising car that he mentions was a gift from his dad's firm that he repaints and makes it like this. This is a company that is nowadays would probably not, people would not raise an eyebrow to, but the DIY ethos here was the reason why they were able to basically say, okay, we get 500 people, we're charging all of them essentially $30. That's going to make these shows worth it. Everyone pays and everyone gets paid, and we all go home. But there is definite downsides to having such of an ethos. And even though, as we talk through 93, 94, and 95, one should really keep in mind the fact that throughout these shows, Michinoku Pro and the wrestling that they're doing, there's never mats at ringside. When we talk especially about the show that happens on July 24th at Mockland, they're wrestling in a parking lot. So you have the fact that safety was not at like one of the prime ethos in 1993 in Sasuke's mind, because it would slow him down. And this is a guy who is constant. He's a perpetual motion machine, essentially. And it's not a spoiler, but by the time we're talking about 97 and 98, there are some real catastrophes that happened due to this ethos.
This is something that I'll note to Mike here, because in our notes that we have for these, I went through, and anytime that Dave has Michinoku Pro results listed in the Observer, I went and copied and pasted them into the document for the episode. And like I said last week, Dave watched a ton of Universal. Dave covered Universal from the jump, and as a result, we're lucky enough that he covers Michinoku Pro Wrestling from the result. But you have to remember how small Michinoku was when they formed. The fact that Dave has any results is amazing, but there's a lot of shows as you go through 93, especially.
Okay, just interject. Dave was talking to Wally.
Yes, yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. It's funny. There's a few things as we go along, like the Super J Cup, and then the first All Japan Tokyo Dome that Shinzaki is on. And I think Sasuke's on the second All Japan Tokyo Dome show. But there's a few things where it's like, oh, wow, Dave clearly had a source in the room for these booking meetings, whether it was Fumi Saito or Wally or somebody else. It's just like, wow, Dave's coverage is really good for these events. But Dave has a bunch of results throughout April of 1993, but he doesn't have all of them. Like I said, this April series starts on April 19th and it runs through May 4th. They're running almost 6 days a week for 3 weeks in a row. I mean, the amount of shows that Michinoku runs at the beginning is just completely astounding. And then you start to see in May of 1993, they're not only now working in their home promotion, they're still working in Universal. And then we have this note from April 19th, 1993 in The Observer, where Dave says that Great Sasuke, Super Delphin, Kendo, and Los Espantos are working the FMW Kawasaki Stadium show in exchange, and this is very important, in exchange for Atsushi Onita working on the Universal May 7th Korakuen Hall show. Onita will form a tag team with Rocky Santana, who the fans chant Onita at because they look like brothers to begin with, and after getting the gimmick over, Santana started wearing the same ring costume and doing Onita's mannerisms. Mike, before you jump in, I'm going to also read this Observer note from the March 8th, 1993 Observer, so going back just a month, where Dave wrote that Super Astro, Brazzo Di Plantino, and Ultimo Dragon would also work that May 7th Korakuen Hall show for Universal. And Dave noted that, of course, Dragon got his start there, but had not worked in Universal since jumping to the SWS, which was already at this point in WAR. I got news for you, Mike. Spoiler alert incoming. None of those men work the May 7th Korakuen Hall show for Universal, and that becomes a huge problem for the promotion.
Yeah, so for first, just touching on the note about how much that they run basically from the 22nd up to Kawasaki Dreams, I think that running that much for this roster that was, as we talked about on the last episode, maybe wrestling at most 4 times every 3 months. So you're not having any sort of actual in-ring growth. Well, doing 6 shows a week for 3 weeks, I think by the time we get into our show that happens on June 19th, and especially the Mockland show, we start to see some really profound exponential growth in some of the abilities of these wrestlers. But yeah, once again, Hisashi Shenma is getting burnt by Atsushi Onita. I mean, every single time he tries to work with this guy, it doesn't work out. But I mean, shocker, I don't know how much of this was him and how much of this was his the man that was actually in charge at Universal. He's Asune, his just fail son. We'll get more into that as we talk about these Universal shows. But yeah, just completely trying to fill the house with everything, seeing how Asai was that draw in 1991 for them. And as we would see very quickly, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, for Astro and Brazzo and Ultimo, we never really get an update as to what happens. For Onita, we'll have a follow-up for that in just a second, but it's a shame that doesn't happen. In terms of the amount of work that Michinoku was doing in the early days, I mean, Mike, we saw it with Toryumon, we see it with Dragon Gate today. Why do you think, and we recorded this in March of 2025, why do you think Akihiro Sahara is getting as good as he is so quickly? Because he's always wrestling. And that is, something that I would assume that, Sasuke learned in Mexico, that Ultimo learned in Mexico. And when they started their promotions, they certainly made sure to instill that work ethic in their roster. Two other notes here from the March 8th, 1993 Observer. These are things I specifically held off on to talk about on this episode instead of the last one. One is that Dave notes that Michinoku Pro Wrestling signed a television deal with a local station out of Iwate to do a 1 card per month show starting in June. Mike, to my knowledge, the only footage we ever see of this Iwate television deal, and maybe the only time it ever aired, was the June 19th show that we'll talk about here shortly.
Yeah, so this was Iwate Cable Broadcasting. This was one of the many TV stations that showed up to Yahaba on that opening show. It seems like that this was also a show that their radio branch was also doing like live play-by-play for.
Which is awesome. I would love to bring that back.
Yeah, I mean, we are both just big baseball nerds, but just like the idea of, instead of me listening to Eric Nadel call the Texas Rangers on the radio at night, the idea that Mr. Lucha could be talking to us about what cool devastation Jinsei Sasaki is up to, man, that would have been so charming.
That would have been fantastic. The other note we have here, this comes, now we're going to jump back ahead to April, the April 26, 1993 Wrestling Observer newsletter. This will be an ongoing storyline in this series, especially in 1993 and 1994. And before I read this, I want to make it abundantly clear, because we're recording these shows in 2025, and this is something that feels important to note. What I'm about to read is not anti-Dave Meltzer sentiment, because what he reports here never comes to fruition, but I think it is far more a reflection of either the chaos of the great Sasuke's life or the chaos of the early days of Michinoku Pro, and I fully believe that at some point these things that I'm about to read were planning on happening, which is the ongoing storyline of what Michinoku Pro wrestlers are reportedly going to Mexico and for what promotion. And we get our first one of these in the April 26, 1993 Observer, where in the EMLL section, so keep in mind, not Universal, not AAA, but EMLL, Dave reports that the Great Sasuke and Super Delphin are headed here in June. Mike, they do not head there in June.
Yeah, they're too busy running shows in Iwate.
Yes, they are. So that takes us to the May 5th, 1993 Kawasaki Stadium show. This is... I don't know what your level of familiarity is with FMW, especially around this time period. I know very little about it, but I know that 5/5/93 has to be considered to be one of the most important events in Japanese wrestling history, put on by a non-New Japan, All Japan, or Noah type promotion.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about 5/5/93 and how F&W was able to get about 40,000 people in the stadium, it becomes one of the real, other than what New Japan and All Japan was doing, this kind of made Golden Week shows, at least special big shows, into a big thing. And in your main event of Atsushi Onita going up against Terry Funk in 1993 was such a huge and relevant match for how that Onita presented himself, and then how really Terry Funk was transitioning from the end of that WCW run into his middle-aged and crazy hardcore run. But that wasn't just all of it. My overall F&W experience case is almost completely links to the Dragon system, to be quite honest. I've seen some of the Onita exploding barbed wire matches, and for me, and I think that longtime listeners of mine would know, like, just with like my sentiments and what I usually really enjoy, FMW was never necessarily the promotion for me. But you already see, though, I mean, with Onita and how strongly he ends up becoming like this presence. And I mean, even though his launch in 1989, took 4 years to get to this point, I feel like that at least like 93 through 95 for FMW with these Kawasaki shows, it becomes like one of the real like trademarks of the 90s in pro wrestling.
And I think it's a huge seal of approval for Michinoku Pro to work in front of all of these big crowds that they did for FMW that year, and to work in front of a promotion that was covered so intensely by the Japanese press at the time. And that is really something that we'll talk about here in either an episode or two when there's a Michinoku Pro and FMW collaboration in Cork and Hall, where there's a very famous photo of Jinsei Shinzaki that makes the rounds and is a fold-out poster in a magazine, and it's like, oh my God, who is this guy? What is he doing? And that coverage happens because they're working for FMW far more so than at the end of 1993 just being Michinoku Pro wrestlers. It's a huge seal of approval to be on this show. And there's a trios match here that is, the Michinoku Pro offer match, which is Battle Ranger Z, who was one of the original FMW dojo graduates, Kendo and the Great Sasuke against Espanto 4, Espanto 5, and Super Delphin. There's a few versions of this match out there. There's a handheld of this show that is the entire show. Nothing's cut. You can go ahead and watch that. I like watching the clipped version of this show, the commercial release that is just 2 hours. The undercard is cut down a ton. This match is cut down a ton. But I like the way this match flows just even in that commercial release. Maybe because, and this is, this was so surprising to be watching it, but this match is kind of the Kendo show. Like, you watch him wrestle in front of 30,000 people, and you're like, God damn, this guy is something else. He has this charisma that is just universal, no pun intended, in every possible way.
Right. And I think it's worth noting as we talk about the match and as we move forward, of course, the Michi Pro natives who are really showing up at this point are just Sasuke and Delphin, and we'll watch how quickly this all changes. But yeah, I actually decided to watch the handheld, and then I went back and watched the clipped form. Mm-hmm. And the clipped form is a much better experience because
that's kind of what I figured, because the full match is pretty long.
20 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
And really, for like that 20 minutes, you're really kind of waiting for Kendo and Sasuke to kind of do their bits. Battle Ranger Z is not bad. I think the other offer match that happens at the Nishimoya Stadium show is a better performance from him. But you really like it's a lot of capital W working, and that is, of course, Kendo's best ability. Is he is the first Weta worker of Michinoku Pro history, because he just does bits all the time, and he starts the ring, he starts in the match, and you get the entire stadium just doing his Kendo clap, and then his hot tag, he immediately falls off the top rope. It's just one of those things that on a show like this, having Kendo be kind of the other representation of Michinoku Pro is such an important deal, especially when you consider that Sasuke and Delphin, like, they are right now finally getting to the point where they've maybe both of them combined have had 200 matches, maybe. Like these are still guys so young in their career, and it becomes really important to have someone like Kendo there who's able to kind of tie it all together at the very least. If things go wrong, you just tag in Kendo, and he's going to probably do like his dancing thing with everyone, and the crowd's going to pop, and you have everyone back with you.
Of course, that FMW show headlined by Terry Funk versus Atsushi Onita, it leads to a little bit of a problem. That show was May 5th. The Universal Cork and Hall show that Onita was booked on was May 7th. And we have this note from the May 17th, 1993 Wrestling Observer newsletter, in which Dave says, the May 7th Universal card at Cork and Hall drew the smallest crowd, estimated at well under 1,000 in many years for wrestling at that building. Onita was originally scheduled to team with Rocky Santana, his Mexican lookalike, and Kendo in the main event against Espanto 4-5 and Scorpio Jr., but he was still injured from the match 2 nights earlier and was replaced with FMW wrestler Battle Ranger. Onita did come to ringside, and on the mic said that he would work a Universal show in the future and team with Santana. Spoiler alert, that does not happen.
And you look at the remainder of the showcase, and you're opening with Leopardo Negro versus someone who would very quickly become Grand Nanawa, Taka versus Shiru. You have Xochitl Hamada doing an offer match, because you also have Hamada there. Or Hamada's not actually on the show.
He's not on this show, and
Yeah,
I don't know why.
But you are basically at this point using the Michinoku Pro roster, and the only like really kind of interesting thing of note that that becomes really important during the summer, Delphin defeats Celestial, who is better known to us in the series, Blackman, for his UWA World Welterweight title, and that becomes kind of a belt that I have my suspicions that Delphin pretty much bought that. But bought the belt, but the UWA belt becomes such a central figure for Michinoku Pro over the summer.
Yeah, it does. And that is the only thing worth watching on this show is that Delphin versus Celestial match. If you watch the footage we talked about last week and you were like, wow, Delphin and Blackman have really good chemistry together, I got news for you. Their singles match is also very, very good. Their one in March is good. Their one in May is good. They have more as time goes along. They were very good opponents with one another. But what we see here is this cascade of events that bring Universal to the point of no return. You know, for whatever reason, Super Astro, who was a fan favorite in the earliest days of Universal, and obviously Ultimo Dragon, who by this point is an international star, they do not work that May 7th show. That falls through. You have the promise of Onita, and then the fact that Onita can't work that show on May 7th. And then you get to June. In June of 1993 is where the wheels officially fall off for Universal Pro Wrestling. Before I read what is just a fascinating series of events between Sasuke, Delphin, and the man we'll refer to as Shinma Jr. going forward. This is Hisashi Shinma's son, the president of Hamada's Universal. A really crazy series of events there. Before I get to that, though, I do want to read this from June 7th, 1993 in The Observer. Super Delphin is headed to the UWA in Mexico as the UWA Light Heavyweight Champion. Mike, this does not happen. Super Delphin appears in Universal in 91 and 92 in Mexico, and he has not been back to Mexico since.
So this is just going to be a note for the sickos. A fun game that you could play as you go through the 1993 Observers is how many different ways Dave calls Super Dolphin Super Dolphin. Yeah, you get Super Dolphin a whole lot. El Delphine is what's used on June 7th, and then he just calls him Hiro Wakita, which is not his name. So it's just kind of a fun ongoing thing that's like, yeah, no, that's Delphin. But boy, does Dave not stick with a name with him at least through the summer.
No. So again, April 26th, Sasuke and Delphin going to EMLL. That does not happen. June 7th, Delphin going to UWA in Mexico. That does not happen. It is a very fun ongoing game, and we are nowhere near done with it. But in the June 8th, 1993 Observer, again, we'll refer to Shinma's son here as Shinma Jr., just because his name is incredibly hard to pronounce, in my opinion.
Do you want me to say it once, because I do know how to pronounce it, so you don't have to.
Yeah, let's try to work this out on air, because I even have like enunciation notes on it, and my brain is still going, no, I don't think you're going to want to say that.
To my understanding, it's pronounced Hisasune.
Hisasune. All right, we're going to give that a shot. So the June 8th, 1993 Observer, Universal President Hisasune Shinma announced at his group's 6-4 card at Korakuen Hall that the promotion will be folding after the August 14th Korakuen Hall show. Many of the Universal wrestlers will continue to tour northern Japan with Michinoku Pro Wrestling. However, the Lucha Libre style won't be in major cities like Tokyo and Osaka any longer. So what we have here, this is important to note, there's going to be a few dates and times that get lost due to history and get a little confusing. So what we have here, just based off of what I read, is Shinma comes out at the June 4th Universal Pro Wrestling show in Korakuen and says, hey guys, it's been a good run, but Universal is closing in August. Now, Sasuke writes extensively about this in his book, again, Sasuke's Source, came out in 1995. And here's what Sasuke had to say about the June 1993 Universal Pro Wrestling Tour. He says, at that time, I was in the Tohoku branch of Universal, so naturally, I participated in the Universal Series with the same members. In June, Universal's 30th anniversary series, Grand Estrella 1993, began. Ironically, this memorable 30th anniversary series became the series where I said goodbye to Universal. In the June series, as usual, the fees for us young Japanese wrestlers were not paid. Delphin and I had finally had enough and told the president of the company, if we don't get any more pay, we won't be appearing in Universal anymore. Michinoku Pro can do well on its own. The president of the company was worried, but he replied in a raspy voice, okay, you don't have to appear anymore. So Delphin and I were absent from the middle of the series. And for anybody confused, series translates into tour, what we would recognize as the Universal Tour. Sasuke continues. However, on the day before the final match of the series in Korakuen Hall on June 4th, President Shinma changed his attitude completely and begged us to appear, saying, I'll pay you the fee for tomorrow's match in advance, so please appear at all costs. Since Hamada had also asked us, can you please appear to save face, we had no choice but to agree and decided to appear at that match. However, we were basically prepared to never appear in Universal matches in the future unless we were paid our previous fees. At the Korakuen Hall event on June 4th, something strange happened. After the opening ceremony, President Shinma suddenly announced the dissolution of Universal during his speech in the ring. The announcement said that Universal Pro Wrestling would take a break after August 14th. We were shocked at how abrupt and irresponsible it was. At the local venue for the final show, we had a discussion with President Shinma about the payment of the overdue fees. We asked what will happen to the accumulated wages. However, no matter how much we talked, we could not get a satisfactory answer. In the end, the talks were abrupt and ended abruptly. We had planned to talk again after the show, but Mr. Shinma left the venue in the middle of the show and returned to Tokyo. We were angry at his irresponsible response, and at the same time, we felt like giving up. After the show, I stood in front of the waiting room and told the media everything about the internal affairs of Universal. Up until now, Universal wrestlers had not been paid. This would be the last time I would step into the Universal ring. From now on, I officially declared in front of the media and fans that I would be working with Michinoku Pro. Later, Mr. Shinma retracted his announcement of the dissolution of Universal, but that didn't matter. Through our discussions with Mr. Shinma, we learned one thing for sure. It was the fact that Mr. Shinma had no ability to pay the wages, nor had any sincerity in supporting the wrestlers. After the June series, we officially became independent along with most of the young wrestlers from Universal. At that time, all the wrestlers currently in Michinoku Pro were officially affiliated with Michinoku Pro.
Yeah, so I think there are several things we should kind of point out about this. Throughout the book, and of course this is Sasuke's perspective of it, he does not mince words at all about Shenma Jr. It becomes very clear that the issue and the thesis that we laid out to Universal's downfall and why it led to Michinoku Pro was the not running enough dates, and the dates that they ran were in venues and in markets that would basically just pay for the foreign wrestlers. There would be like successful shows outside of Tokyo, such as on this tour, they had a sellout in Osaka listed at 1985, but it's worth noting you had a main event there of Super Dolphin in Osaka. Already a huge local draw in that area. But by 1993, at least when you're talking about people like Delphin and Sasuke, it's 2 years of lost wages. So when the story of Universal usually gets talked about, it is, okay, Hamada's promotion that he brings in all these Mexican wrestlers that does pretty well, does but most well when Yoshihiro Asai is around. But as soon as Asai goes, everything goes to shit and everyone leaves to start Michinoku Pro. Case, would you say that at least up until now is the misconception about Hamada's Universal?
Well, I think it's been perceived as the truth. Now, I don't necessarily agree, and this is where I can't tell where you're at. I don't feel like there's historical vitriol pointed at the direction of Hamada saying that he's the one that screwed this up. I do think, because he is the public-facing promoter of the promotion, that people go, well, okay, Hamada must have done something, thus the promotion failed. I don't know if people necessarily have curled up their fists for 30 years and went like, but man, that guy really fucked up this promotion. But it is a promotion that petered out very similar to Dragon Gate USA.
Yeah, but the big point is that Hamada is the person that when people would point fingers for the promotion, since his name was attached to it, it was his weight around his neck.
Yeah, and especially because common wrestling logic would tell you that if you know that Asai left the promotion because he wasn't getting pushed hard enough in his mind, that it was likely Hamada being the one to throttle him. And as I learned writing about Hamada, shortly after his death, that it was the heat between Asai and the promotion was heat between Asai and Shinma. And that every time Asai would go to Shinma and say, like, I'm not getting paid enough. I'm recruiting these wrestlers with my popularity. I should be pushed more. Shinma would turn around and go, Hamada, you're in the main event. We're going to keep on pushing Hamada. And that is what led to Asai leaving Universal in the first place.
Right. So Hamada, and when I say like people like shake his fist, this is the thing that's always brought up about his Hall of Fame candidacy is the failure. And I think that at least there is that difference really between the international coverage of Universal where Hamada is kind of tagged to it. And we see, at least from accounts from Asai and Sasuke, they are more than willing to point the finger at another person. And they paint a picture that the promotion that is called Hamada's Universal, what it seems like Hamada's real role was basically just being the foreign Gaijin booker, basically. So
and that becomes a thing where if you're going to put blame on Hamada, and I'm not even sure if blame is the right word to use here, but as I talked about when he passed, Universal in 1990 is booking talent from Mexico at a time where Mexico is completely different than it is after the summer of 1992 when AAA formed. And
absolutely.
So the reason that you see, I think, a dip in talent in 1993 is that he has to book from the internal Universal roster now, which means no Casas, no Santo, Fuerza Guerrera's not walking through that door anytime soon. He doesn't have the relationship with AAA at all at this point, and has a very, very loose relationship with CMLL, but he's now forced to deal with the pickings of a Universal promotion that is dying on the vine in Mexico as well.
Right. And the interesting thing about all of this is during this time, Champ Forum actually, when they would cut to the studio portions case while we were compiling footage and getting things together, I thought I had a whole bunch of like full shows and they ended up being just episodes of Champ Forum. So I ended up watching a good deal of it, and you would have Dr. Lucha go through and was actually like explaining with like a giant flowchart the entire situation of the big creation of AAA and how it basically pulled apart UWA with it. So it seems like really it just was an issue, maybe not even within Japan. It just seems like it's an issue with how it was covered in the United States that has kind of maligned Hamada because his name gets attached to the promotion, when it is very clear if you read the accounts of the people that went through it. There's one person who seems to be in control and one person who seems to be unwilling to change his mind about anything, and it's Hisasune Shinma.
You're exactly right about that. So before I read this next passage from The Observer, which has a crazy note about Universal that I don't think has been widely discussed, mainly because it never happens. But again, it was the goal of Universal going forward that we'll read here in just a second. But Sasuke talks about being begged to appear on the June 4th Korakuen Hall show for Universal. They run Korakuen on June 4th. They also run Korakuen on June 7th. June 4th is Sasuke versus Dos Caras in the main event. June 7th, they actually run Sasuke versus Delphin in a rather underwhelming UWA World Welterweight Championship match, but they run Sasuke versus Delphin. My read of this, because it gets a little confusing with Sasuke's firsthand accounts, my read of this is that Sasuke and Delphin were begged to appear on both of those Korakuen shows, and that Shinma leaves in the middle of the June 7th show.
Me too.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense to me, because I don't think Sasuke, after being begged to work the June 4th show, would have come back for June 7th had Shinma left in the middle of the June 4th show. So that's the timeline I choose to believe. Are you in the same boat?
Yeah, just because like when you like mention, or at least when Sasuke mentions like his essential, hey guys, I'm stepping out from the locker room, let me tell all the press all the dirty laundry, it has to be happening at a Korakuen show, I would feel like, or a Tokyo show.
Yes. Because they run I think they run Chiba on June 5th, but it's a nothing Universal house show.
Yeah, and even though Chiba is within the greater megalopolis, I mean, it would not have had the effect that his announcement made. So it has to have happened at Korakuen Hall, and with how the schedule is, that just points to the show that Shinma bounced from has to be June 7th.
Yes. Okay, so we have this note. This is from the June 21st, 1993 Observer. And I said last week, I said there's going to be an ongoing series of Observer threads, much like where Sasuke and Delphin are going to wrestle in Mexico that they never end up wrestling in. There's going to be this ongoing theme of Universal's closing. No, they're not. Oh, wait, Universal's closing. Oh, wait, no, they're not. And again, Dave is reporting what Universal is putting out in the world. This is him in real time trying to make sense of this promotion that is just completely falling apart rapidly in real time. And so on June 21st, 1993, he writes, Universal won't be folding up after all. President Shinma announced that the promotion would be folding on the June 4th show at Korakuen Hall with the group's final card in August. However, at the June 7th Korakuen Hall show, Naoki Otsuka, who was a house show promoter for New Japan in the early 80s and was later instrumental in the 1984 jumping of Riki Choshu and more than a dozen other New Japan wrestlers to All Japan, announced that he would be starting a new promotion in September using the Universal name with Hisashi Shinma working in the office of the group. Now, note, this is the father. This is the big deal. Hisashi Shinma, the guy who, has an accomplished track record when it comes to promoting pro wrestling. So this is going to be Otsuka and Shinma promoting a new Universal group starting in September. And Dave writes that Otsuka said the goal of the new Universal would combine lucha libre style with martial arts mixed matches, and announced that he wanted to bring back Punish and Crush, which is Gato and Jado, from Mexico, and continue using Super Delphin, Gran Hamada, and Great Sasuke. However, the next day, Sasuke said that he was going to wrestle exclusively for Michinoku Pro, the small regional promotion that's run by his family, and that neither he nor Delphin would join the new Universal group. Word has it that the new Universal group will debut with a fall card in Budokan Hall, which is a major undertaking and one on the surface that sounds out of the league for a group with such a limited following. We'll pause here.
Yeah.
This Universal never happens. Basically the timeline from here on out for Universal is they run that August 14th Korakuen show. I think there's 4 matches in a battle royal. There might only be 3 matches in a battle royal because it has no native Japanese wrestlers on it other than Hamada. Hamada stays, and then you're talking about bare bones UWA guys that are flown in, and it's the end of Dragon Gate USA. It's Dragon Gate USA with Yosuke Santa Maria on the show, basically. That is kind of how Universal ends. They come back and run a pair of shows in December in Korakuen Hall, and I don't know if this is Otsuka and Shinma the father being involved. It certainly doesn't feel like that. There's nothing splashy about those shows. They exist in handhelds because there's a good Hamada versus Viano 4 match on one of those shows, but that's kind of it. And then they stumble through a spring tour in 1994, and they're done until Shinma picks this group back up in 1998. But I'm blown away by the thought of a new Universal debuting in Budokan Hall in 1993.
Yeah, and especially given the fact that, as you laid out, they don't have any native roster. No one really wants to work with them within Japan. Shinma is still obsessed with the idea of combining lucha libre with mixed martial arts.
Oh my god, it's his favorite thing. Yeah. I wish I loved anything in life as much as he loved that idea.
Yeah, and really the only thing that actually happens in this new history for Universal is Hisasune Shinma recedes into the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
I spent about 2 hours, Case, yesterday trying to see what this guy has been up to ever since. He has shown up in some talk events where him and his dad will talk about Universal, but he does not ever have a major role within pro wrestling that is not directly linked to his father, Hisashi, after this moment. So we could bid adieu, at least to our character here, Hisasune Shinma, perhaps one of the worst money mark owners in at least Japanese wrestling history.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I'm trying to think. I think it's Hisashi Shinma that is involved in the 1998 short-lived relaunch of Universal. It's not the son. It's Shinma proper. So he goes away after this. he's such a, I don't know if mysterious figure is the right word. He's such a non-entity in the history of pro wrestling that a lot of people think that Hisashi Shinma was the point guy for Universal, when in fact it was his son who just did nothing after this.
Right, yeah, and I think that's also the thing that the Hamada issue earlier, you kind of have two elder statesmen that I think it is natural within the pro wrestling industry that you kind of look towards, and instead you actually have what people in the bad social media accounts say is happening with AEW, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Dave would continue. We'll finish out here the June 21st, 1993 Observer. This is sort of the end of Universal, and I'll look at the state of Japanese independence before Michinoku has what is a pretty strong summer of 1993, in which Dave says he's talking about PWC, which is Pro Wrestling Crusaders. He says PWC is also said to be in trouble, and there's already talk that George and Shunji Takano will join Universal, although Shunji's size, 6'7", 330 pounds, is ridiculous to try to work in the ring with luchadors, and that Shinma and Otsuka are trying to get a talent trade agreement with FMW.
Case, are you ready for Mike's Tangent Corner for this episode?
Folks, get ready, because Mike is ready to go on a tangent.
All right, Case. What is Pro Wrestling Crusaders? Well, it is a splinter promotion that actually so happens to be one of the direct descendants of, or the direct ancestor of DDT Pro Wrestling. You have people from that promotion, Shinshiro Takagi and Nosawa Rongai, go and start DDT. But how do we get to Pro Wrestling Crusaders? And how does this relate to the overall Japanese wrestling economy and world? Case, we need to address Super World of Sports.
Do we have to?
Well, I think this is kind of important and at least fills in a kind of a cultural gap.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's the thought of SWS that is repulsive, not the explanation.
Because for our listeners who are here primarily for Dragon Gate coverage, SWS, if you want to draw the line back, is the precursor to modern day Dragon Gate. So how does this happen? So in 1990, right before the bubble burst and the lost decades began in Japan, remember I talked about that in our first episode, the Megane Super Corporation has a private contract with Junichiro Tenryu. Tenryu, in April of 1990, he splits from All Japan and is announcing that he is going to be, with the help from Megane Super, launching his own promotion that is going to be featured and is going to be set up in a different way. For those who do not know, Junichiro Tenryu was a decorated sumo wrestler before entering the pro wrestling industry, and that's going to play into SWS, and that is going to play into the downfall of SWS. So Megane Super wants to get involved here. They're $1 billion corporation, and they become kind of tagged with this thing called Money Press, because this is, and it's covered hugely in the Japanese press at the time. This is viewed as a outsider corporation coming in and just throwing so much money around that it disrupts kind of the equilibrium between New Japan Pro Wrestling and All Japan. And you end up getting a lot of people from All Japan Pro Wrestling, some people from New Japan Pro Wrestling, and indie guys who kind of have floated around since the end of IWE and never really sticking to place. Remember, Case, when I said that Tenryu was a successful sumo wrestler?
Yes.
So this plays into how SWS is set up. SWS was not set up like either All Japan Pro Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling. It is instead set up in a more traditional sumo manner. In sumo wrestling, you have these camps and you have what is called essentially a heya. Whenever Don Fuji talks about Fuji Heya, that's the reference he's making. But these heya is essentially all-in-one training school, dormitory system, everything. Essentially, as a sumo pro wrestler, the heya becomes your life outside of actual sumo wrestling. But the big thing about the heyas is they're all vertically integrated and kept apart. So there can be a heya Nagoya, heya in Tokyo, a lot of heyas in Tokyo, but basically they're their own kind of self-contained organisms. He incorporates this in SWS by creating 3 stables that everyone in the roster is going to be a part of. Tenryu, with all of his All Japan former pro wrestlers, form Revolution. Geki Dojo comes out from Shogun K.Y. Wakamatsu as a heel leader, and it's kind of your heel army. And then you have Palestra, which is the Takano brothers, which are mostly the New Japan wrestlers alumni. Here's the thing about having this kind of system case. It falls apart near immediately because no one wants to work with each other because no one trusts Genichiro Tenryu. It literally becomes Revolution versus anti-Tenryu, and nothing goes well with it. It is impossible to book. They try to like build like individual like training schools for each of these groups. It is just a catastrophe. They cannot work together, and it just ultimately just goes kaput. And then after that happens, SWS closes up in 1992. Megane Super pulled their support, but they didn't really pull it because they instead decided to give essentially two of the big Heias their own basically private funding for the next few years. WAR comes about from Tenryu and the Revolution Heia, and they get the lion's share of that. And actually, Megane Super had a relationship with Tenryu up until his retirement. They kind of become like a permanent sponsor with him. The others form something called Network of Wrestling, which is a lot more shoot kind of style. However, the Takano brothers don't get in good with them and now kind of peters out, and they instead create Pro Wrestling Crusaders, which ends up being the predecessor to DDT and is most known really for kind of being the true start of pro wrestling for Shenshiro Takagi, and the beer garden event started from there. So that's the independent landscape case, and that's all the issues with SWS that I felt like were kind of important to know, to just get a sense of how wild the independent landscape has just changed, essentially from Pioneer Senshi in 1989 to only 1993. Things are happening at a rapid pace on the Japanese indie scene.
I'm very glad that was said, because obviously SWS not something that's talked about often today. But you're right. That's just a good historical anecdote. I have nothing more to add other than that I really enjoyed that. So we come away from the June Universal shows. Sasuke's out, Delphin's out. Universal loses their entire native roster. There isn't even really like a Kawada and Fushi type from the All Japan Noah split. All the Japanese guys other than Hamada, because his name is roughly on the promotion, all those guys go and join Michinoku Pro. So Michinoku Pro Wrestling, they forge ahead post-Universal. I have this note from a Dr. Lucha blog that he wrote a few years ago talking about hanging out with Jinsei Shinzaki, which is relevant because the last time we talked Michinoku Pro, he was Mongolian Yuga. He was in a mask. When we see him here on the June 19th show that we'll talk about in just a second, he is Jinsei Shinzaki as we have seen him over the last 30 years. And so Dr. Lucha wrote, it was February 1993 at the JCTV studio in Roppongi. On the day of recording Fighting Champ Forum, Wally Yamaguchi brought Jinsei Shinzaki to the studio to record a promotional video. Of course, I knew him from when he was playing Mongolian Yuga at Universal Studios, but in my opinion, that character was a dud. There was nothing that resonated with me. If he had transformed into a character other than a pilgrim after that, I might have passed him over. And then Dr. Lucha went on to talk about crafting Jinsei Shinzaki's character as we know him today. And of course, he is one of the most important parts of Michinoku Pro Wrestling. But last episode, I tried to emphasize how important Dr. Lucha was to this promotion. Not only the commentary and, some of the agreements he had with Mexican talent, or at least the friendship that he had with Mexican talent that would aid this promotion later on, but also he is largely credited, he and Wally Yamaguchi, with creating the aura of Jinsei Shinzaki, and that is very, very important as we get into this June 19th show, Mike.
Yeah, this June 19th show really kind of becomes the start of the series that we'll talk about between this first show that happens and then the mock land show and then the studio taping. And we immediately on this June 19th show, we get that 30-minute documentary on Sasuke that we talked about during the last episode. And our first matches we have are the Michinoku Pro taped introductions to one Jinsei Shinzaki. He has a series of matches, one against Akihiro Yoneyama, better known today as Yone Genjin, and one against Shiryu. But we get to kind of see already at this point, really, the Jinsei Shinzaki act, how it works with Mr. Toyota, and really in these matches, kind of the emergence of Ted Tanabe as a referee figure, I feel like.
Yeah. I mean, Ted Tanabe, for those that don't know, was the in-house referee for Michinoku Pro when Michinoku Pro and Osaka Pro split in 1999, it becomes, a version of Dragon Gate and Glit, right? Everybody's persona non grata, with the exception of Ted Tanabe, who would continue to referee both Michinoku Pro and Osaka Pro because he was so beloved by everybody. And we see him with Wally Yamaguchi as now a heel manager in Mr. Toyota. You see Ted Tanabe come into the frame, and he becomes, a very important figure in Michinoku Pro going forward.
Right. And I think that by the end of the summer, we kind of have the established kind of Michinoku brain trust that I think that figures like Yamaguchi and Dr. Lucha kind of got forgotten over the years and said, in a way, I think Shinzaki himself, but of course he takes over a management role in the promotion, kind of like assumes that role that at least in 1993, you have these two who are very clearly kind of the people that are Sasuke's 1 and 2 kind of creative presences and people who would have been in the room for all the conversations.
Yeah. And so, this June 19th upload is very interesting because the first half hour is a documentary on the start of Michinoku Pro. Again, this is not Gaiora Chant Forum. This is not Samurai TV Battle Station. This is a broadcast from Owate Broadcasting. And we talked in the last episode about how strong the local press was during the early days of Michinoku Pro because it was a novel concept to have localized pro wrestling even in 1993. I mean, they were the first to do it. And so you get this upload that is an hour and 20 minutes with the first half hour being a documentary on Michinoku Pro. And then once you jump forward to the June 19th show, you get Jinsei Shinzaki killing men. And I was unprepared for just how much I would enjoy this. Not only the back-to-back squash matches against the two aforementioned wrestlers that you named, but the post-match brawl with Terry Boy that sets up a match.
Smoke.
Oh, he wants the smoke. That sets up their match for July 24th. But as I talked about last week, for as much Michinoku Pro as I've watched and that I love, I feel like I have two blind spots in big, great Sasuke singles matches and anything that Jinsei Shinzaki did in this promotion, because historically I've leaned towards at least thinking that I am not a big Jinsei Shinzaki fan. I will tell you for the rest of this episode 2 of Those Days, I'm a Jinsei Shinzaki fan. He is so dominant. He is so imposing. This character is so interesting in the way that he maneuvers around the ring. I think in the June 19th show, in the July 24th show, and in the August 24th show, he does nothing but hit home runs.
Yeah, this really, for him, he had a little bit of the universal background with it, but I feel like the big story that we will be talking about throughout this episode is the massive exponential growth of these wrestlers, and Shinzaki might be the biggest example of that because just adding the aura of the religious pilgrim, his invulnerability, and even his interactions with Tanabe and Toyota, aka Wally Yamaguchi, throughout this, you have like one of the more compelling acts in this promotion. And by the end of this episode, you immediately kind of see what his kind of position is and how he differentiates himself from anything else. And my God, Terry Boy was the person on our first episode of Those Days that I think I was significantly lower on than you. Just the Terry Funk act was not necessarily hitting with me. But throughout the show, or really when we start talking about Mockland, he has probably been like episode to episode the person I've enjoyed the most more from the previous one. Just such a fun angle on a show that has a bunch of fun angles on it.
Well, let's continue talking about him then, because I can summarize the rest of this pretty easily. Basically, all you need to know on this June 19th show, from entrance to post-match angle and blow up and everybody leaving the ring, it's 10 minutes long, where you see Shinzaki against Yonakawa, and then Shinzaki against Shiryu, and then the post-match brawl with Terry Boy. It's almost 10 minutes on the dot. It is such an effective 10 minutes. It makes you question why wrestling is as hard as it is sometimes, because in 10 minutes, I understood everything I needed to know about Jinsei Shinzaki. After that, there's a Super Delphin versus Taka Michinoku match. It's fine. It's, a pretty pedestrian affair between two guys that would go on to have better matches. And then the main event is Sasuke and Kendo, because you got to remember at this point, this would have been really at the tail end of Universal paying half the fee for these Mexican wrestlers to appear in Michinoku. It's Sasuke and Kendo against Los Villanos, Villano 4, and Villano 5. That match to me was boring as shit, and then we didn't even get the finish of it. The TV episode ends before the finish.
We're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time. We missed the post-match angle, which this is worth noting that on that June 19th show, after the main event, that is when Super Delphin came out and said, I will put my title on the line, Sasuke, if you put your mask on the line on the main event of the July 24th show. We don't even get that on camera. We just get this really boring main event and then no payoff whatsoever.
Which is really frustrating, because the one storyline we had on those March shows was Sasuke versus Delphin, and the moving and kind of positioning them, getting them to the match that we're going to have in July. Like, to me, that's a failure of Iwate Broadcasting in a way, because if I'm Sasuke, Dr. Lucha, and Wally Yamaguchi, the two things I would tell them about the show that you need to make sure you have is get Jinsei Senzaki over, make sure we're highlighting that thing, and then make sure that you air our angle leading to our biggest show of this tour. Like, they're kind of let down by broadcasting, I feel like, in that regard.
Oh, I mean, I would completely agree with that. So it's, the 619 show, if you want to watch Jinsei Shinzaki kick some ass, I get it, but otherwise it's totally skippable. And then they would be on tour all the way through July 24th, where they have this big show we're about to talk about. The only note in the Observer that I'll mention before we get to that is on July 12th, when Dave reports that Michinoku Pro would run its first Tokyo card on August 23rd at a smaller venue than Korakuen Hall in the same Korakuen Mall complex. Now, Dave might have meant Hall complex now that I read that out loud.
Yeah, he means the Tokyo Dome City Hall complex. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a TV studio, which again, Wally Yamaguchi at it again. Let's do studio wrestling for Michinoku Pro.
Yeah. And boy, we will talk about that in a moment. But Case, it becomes clear that, at least for a great Sasuke, this second show in Morioka, this one that's actually outside at an amusement park, feels like, at least for him, one of those big last stand moments that we've gotten to see, where like this felt like a show that very much for them was the big intent and purposes. And I think part of that, and Sasuke writes about this becomes the first Michinoku show without any luchadors on it.
That's right. So it's very long-winded in his book, so I won't read it verbatim, but all you need to know is that, they officially split from Universal, but Sasuke realizes that there's not a ton of wrestlers, and the wrestlers that he has, are not fully formed by any means. Taka Michinoku means nothing. Shiryu means nothing. And also, they're not the wrestlers that they would end up being. So Sasuke reaches out to Hamada and asks Hamada for help in booking Mexican wrestlers for the July tour. Hamada, and this is very important to note, agrees and says, we have no heat. We're all good. Essentially, your issue is with Shinma. I'll see what I can do. And then that falls through in part due to what the Mexican embassy in Japan or the Japan embassy in Mexico not holding up their end of the bargain and being unable to get the paperwork needed to get Mexican wrestlers in for this July 24th show. So it ends up being, outside of Wellington Wilkins, an all Japanese Michinoku Pro show, and the very first one at that.
Yeah, and this becomes known as Lucha Fiesta Summer 1993. It's from the Mock Land parking lot in Morioka, Japan. Case, the version that we have and that we were able to watch comes from a commercial tape that was released. It has to have been released like much later, because there are references like Super J Cup and stuff with that. But I think it's time to get into this really important July 24th show. Yeah,
the one thing I'll note is on the commercial release. So there's a version of this out there that has Sasuke versus Delphin and I think Terry Boy versus Shinzaki. Yes. So there's a version out there that has Sasuke versus Delphin and Shinzaki versus Terry Boy. It is from a Champ Forum episode in which they share coverage with the July 7th Wing Show.
That's right.
This we talked about the origin of Champ Forum last week, and a lot of the early Michinoku Pro footage shares a slot with Universal Pro Wrestling, or, maybe some FMW. I might even be misremembering that. But you get this giant Michinoku Pro show, but they don't air the full thing. It's not like Torimon Vamonos Amigos where they got their own spot. This is instead, here is half of a wing show, and here are the 2 matches from this big Michinoku Pro show. The downside of the commercial release is that it seems pretty obvious to me that they recorded commentary in post much after the fact, like you said. And to record commentary, they just brought down the master level, which would have been the crowd, and then just talked over the crowd. So the crowd is very hard to hear, which is a bummer. The commentary is very loud, but I also like having HD Michinoku Pro footage. So, you take the good with the bad.
Check engine light on? Take the guesswork out of your check engine light with O'Reilly Veriscan. It's free. Ask for O'Reilly Veriscan today.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Yeah, and I think that this commercial tape, you do kind of get to see at least a thesis of what a Michinoku Pro show would be in 1993. It's outside. It has people just all on the same level in seats, and you get these guys kind of come out from the crowd into the ring. At some points, there are fireworks, but not in the Onita kind of way. But this show is also really important because we get introductions to not just Wellington Wilkins Jr., kind of the known North American on this roster for the next few years, but we see already that Yoshiko Kimura is now redebuted as Grand Nanawa to start off the show.
That's right. And you mentioned this show being outdoors. I'll read this last excerpt here from Sasuke Soares, in which he says, and a lot of his book, he talks about how meaningful this show was, because had it not gone well, Michinoku Pro likely wouldn't have survived much longer than they did, because not only was this the first show that they promoted to crack over 1,000 fans, but also he notes in the book that after this show, there was an immediate uptick in ticket sales. So Sasuke writes in his book, July 24th was the day that Michinoku Pro's survival depended on. When I woke up in the morning, I looked up at the sky with a prayerful feeling. Unfortunately, a typhoon was approaching that day. If the typhoon had hit Tohoku directly, all events of the day would have been ruined. However, the heavens were on our side for this small group. Although gray clouds hung low and heavy, we managed to avoid the worst-case scenario. Ticket sales were good, with 500 advance tickets sold the day before, with same tickets selling out the day within an hour before the matches started. So, good news here from Sasuke, their biggest show up to this point. And Mike, I hand it to you to talk about July 24th, 1993, Michinoku Pro.
So one thing that we haven't really talked about with these early Michinoku Pro shows is that the standard touring show always starts out with everyone coming out for in the ring and introductions. That is usually where you would have gotten, at least in March, outside of the unmasking angle, the interactions between Delphin and Sasuke. But here, a mysterious guy comes out to trash talk Akira Yoneyama. He ends up being Shigekazu Tajiri, and that leads us to a Shiryu promo and immediately into our first match of Lucha Fiesta. Grand Nanawa versus Shiryu, and Nanawa wins with the grounded octopus stretch after Shiryu misses a swanton. This match was a little bit frustrating in a way, but it was a real kind of strong introduction to the character that we would see a lot of for the rest of this episode and throughout the series in Grand Nanawa.
Yeah, we will see many better Grand Nanawa matches than this one also. Let me tell you, this was a long 13 minutes in my opinion, him and Shiryu.
Yeah, there was one real bad dive that just looked real awful because the fact that they are landing on asphalt.
Yes.
to just keep that in mind, the asphalt thing. It won't play as much into our next match, Wellington Wilkins Jr. versus Nahiro Hoshikawa, in what was billed as a points match. Wellington Wilkins Jr., the former UWF wrestler, he just kind of runs through this guy, and this is what we're kind of stuck with Wilkins for the next little bit.
So Wilkins is going to be an interesting one the more footage we watch, because I think if you've ever spent any amount of time watching Michinoku Pro footage, he's a guy that obviously he comes up, he is a mainstay in Michinoku Pro for a very, very long time. He starts wrestling here in 1993. He works Michinoku Pro through the end of the decade, through 1999. He is there. This is his home promotion. This is where he always is. I have no real experience with his work. He's never a guy that I've taken time to stop and watch and, to figure out, necessarily what his deal is. Now, for those that don't know, he was a wrestler out of Minneapolis who would have come up alongside Jerry Lynn and Sean Waltman, if I'm correct in that. I believe I'm correct in that.
Yeah, and he would have been their kind of compatriots as they did Universal Lucha Libre tours, whereas he was doing like UWFI and Fujiwara Gumi.
Yeah, he's, and he even worked a little bit of SWS too. I mean, he's a full-on shoot style guy who just happens to wind up in Michinoku Pro and just never leaves. That's almost the way you can describe it, is he happens to wind up in Michinoku Pro and he never leaves. And so my initial impression of him, look, this is an exhibition match with Hoshikawa. It reminded me, although far less entertaining than for our contemporary Dragon Gate fans, there was the Yoshiki Kato versus Punch Tamanaga exhibition match from a few years ago, in which, Dragon Gate exhibition matches historically, it's a 5-minute time limit. It normally ends 0-0. Nobody scores any falls. And then in that one, Kato happened to submit Tamanaga twice. It blew everybody away. That never happens in Dragon Gate. He debuts the next month officially. This is Wilkins Jr. just beating the life out of Hoshikawa. And I really found Hoshikawa's selling to be far more interesting than what I felt was lifeless offense from Wilkins Jr.
Yeah, we get to what Wilkins actually is good at, ironically, on the next show. Then we get to one of the real highlights of this episode, and for me at least, this is my first notebook match of Michinoku Pro case, and that is Terry Boy versus Jinsei Shinzaki. Goes to a DQ for Shinzaki as Terry Boy bumps the ref out of the ring, causing the DQ in one of the most chaotic matches, at least to this point in Michinoku history.
So this match is not quite a notebook match for me, but I'm glad you also loved it, because it raised a really interesting philosophical and perhaps moral question when it comes to art and stealing art and influence and when it goes too far. Because I watched this match and I watched Jinsei Shinzaki wrestle Terry Boy, and I thought, would wrestling just be in a much better place if more people were doing deliberate Terry Funk ripoff gimmicks? Because my God, did I love watching Terry Boy in this match.
He was the perfect foil for Jinsei Shinzaki, and Shinzaki was the perfect person to have someone kind of doing this tribute gimmick with. It just mixed together, and up to this point, I wasn't necessarily super enthused by Yamaguchi's managerial work, but from here on, Mr. Toyota kind of becomes one of those like really like big figures, at least as the Dolphin Core really gets established, and the way he plays into everything with Shinzaki. And it's a brutal match case.
It really is.
Terry Boy gets dumped over the top rope, hits his like upper shoulder on the ring, but it's really like a 10-foot fall right on the asphalt partway through. And it is brutal. There's sick blood throughout of it. There is a little bit of a botch here, but it kind of works in this because it's basically a guy doing his best impression of 1983 Terry Funk going up against Jinsei Shinzaki, who I guess we haven't really talked about him when we were talking about him destroying people. The other aspect about it is that he's kind of just impervious to pain and he does not sell, which adds a lot to the character.
No, it works completely. I came away from this footage that we watched thinking like, okay, I said in episode 1, part of the reason we wanted to do this was I think Michinoku Pro, the legacy has been sort of summarized into October of 96 through April of 97, these days through Barely Legal. That's what everybody talks about. They vaguely mention trios matches, and then we move on from there. And I don't think anybody's wrong if that's what they think of when they think of Michinoku Pro, but I think there's a deeper story told here. And I started thinking like, okay, well, Delphin at least at one point, was a very well-known wrestler in our circles. And Shinzaki, has WWF stuff and he has FMW stuff and All Japan stuff. Like, people know who Shinzaki is. So why isn't this era remembered a little bit more? And it made me sad knowing that we're not really going to get any Delphin, Shinzaki, and question mark trios matches with those guys against, Sasuke and Sato and Terry Boy and whoever else. Like, it's a real bummer. I think the tag league even starts in 94. We don't have a Michinoku Pro tag league in 93. So we don't get enough Delphin and Shinzaki together, because on their own, they're doing amazing heel work. And I feel like this could have been remembered historically far better had they actually come together and teamed at some point throughout 93. But instead, they're just in the same unit in this vague sense.
Right. And the actual glue of the unit is Nanawa and Toyota, because the thing about Nanawa...
Nanawa would be the third guy. There, go ahead.
Yeah, but the thing about Nanawa, he's very clearly just like the heel young boy. And his entire character kind of is, in a way, the first true example of them kind of using regionalism as a promoting and booking style. Both him and Delphin basically were playing pro Osaka Kansai wrestlers in Tohoku. And basically, whenever you see Nanawa come out, especially starting with the studio show, he's covered in Hanshin Tiger stuff, and he's making constant references to Osaka. And Hanshin Tigers, of course, like the baseball team from that area too. And we don't get those trios matches. That's so frustrating.
No, we don't. And, I think missing out on Terry Boy being this kind of almost doing the proto what Masato Yakishiji would do in 1996. Like, Terry Boy could have gotten his ass kicked in all of these trios matches and become even more lovable as a result, because Terry Boy is really the guy that's jumped off the screen to me. Again, it raises this weird question of, like, should more people just be outwardly doing Terry Funk? Because Terry Boy does nothing original in this match. He does the right-handed punch comeback. He does a beautiful backslide in a way that nobody does backslides anymore. He goes for a spinning toe hold. Wally Yamaguchi runs in. He ends up beating up Wally Yamaguchi. That sets up Shinzaki's comeback. And then the finish of this match, Terry Boy is actually on offense. He begins choking Shinzaki while Terry Boy's in the ring. Shinzaki's on the apron. Ted Tanabe says to break the hold. He does not. Thus, he gets counted out. And Shinzaki wins the match by DQ, but it all makes Terry Boy look really tough, and it makes Shinzaki look like a killer. And you went notebook on this. I went 3.5 stars on this, but whatever way you slice it, whether you're looking at it as almost a prolonged angle, or you're looking at it as a match that just tells a grander story, or you're just looking for the work rate, no matter what way you slice it, this is a really entertaining pro wrestling match.
Yeah, and you have the fact that after the DQ call happens, Terry Boy's trying to do the sleeper hold on Shinzaki, and Shinzaki's going out, but then Tanabe raises his arm on the apron, and Shinzaki comes to, and he just snaps and goes storming into the crowd, and it's just like, who is going to be able to really stop this guy? And yeah, it's going to be like a fun kind of thing, Terry Boy, because I think when we're talking about like Kaientai Deluxe, and when we get really into that, I feel like he really recedes into the background in the comparison to the rest of people in that unit. Seeing him here kind of as this Terry Funk just tribute really kind of put a strong impression in me, and I'm going to see how that develops across the series.
He's been awesome. I did not expect to enjoy Terry Boy through the early Michinoku Pro days as much as I have.
Well, Case, sadly, we have to go through Shigekazu, Tajiri, and Akihira Yoneyama in a mixed rules match. Tajiri wins and cuts a promo. It just feels like an absolute waste of time. And mixed rules fights in 1993 Michinoku Pro just feel like completely unnecessary.
No, they're setting up Yonekawa to eventually be Yone Genjin, but this sucked. It was short, but it still sucked. So let's move on.
And a kind of storyline that was a little bit of a part of the 619 show. Taka Michinoku versus Saito. Saito wins with a devastating comeback or power slam. And it feels like at this time within the Sasuke army or just the babyface side, this major win for Sato kind of firmly puts him, at least when Hamada is not around, as Sasuke's number 2.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, look, there are there's a Sato match coming up that I'm going to want to talk about way more. This was about the weakest version of a Sato versus Taka Michinoku match that you could have. Not bad, but not as good as what they could do. I'll save my Sato thoughts for later.
No, I'm with you on this. It just felt pretty complimentary for these two. And they did make the commentary on the commercial release, did make a Kaintai Deluxe comment. So it does really kind of feel like at this match that notably on this entire show, all singles matches, by the way.
That's true. Our
semi-main event, you really had that kind of positioning. And then we get to the match that has been built up throughout the history of Michinoku Pro. It is for the UWA World Welterweight title versus Great Sasuke's mask, which in Sasuke source, he says, "It would be my retirement because my mask is my life." Great Dolphin defends the title against Great Sasuke, who defends his mask. The winner, of course, ends up being Great Sasuke, victorious, defending his mask, becoming the UWA World Welterweight Champion after 2K brought us in the ring, and then a Ultra Hurricane Rana broken out, I think maybe the first time in history, at least that I've seen in 1993, to win the belt and victorious, celebrating in the ring as fireworks go off around Mockland.
This is a very good match that annoyed me. To jump ahead momentarily, they wrestle a month later, what we'll close out this episode with in just a second, this August 24th show from the studio. The August 24th match was not as good, but it annoyed me way less. This is a rare instance, and this is going to be one of these battles. Again, it's why I avoided a lot of big Sasuke singles matches up until this project is he comes in with a battered leg. Now, canonically, the reason he's selling his leg is the Dos Caras match from Universal on June 4th is a leg match. Caras destroys his leg. Sasuke plays off that up and through this match, basically. But Sasuke never really locks in on how intensely he wants to sell that leg. You know, if you even look at the finishing stretch, he does a Sasuke special that looks like it takes everything in his power to do. And it's this amazing spot because he forcefully throws himself over the top rope and he connects with Delphin. And so it not only causes Sasuke a great amount of pain doing the move, but he nails it. And so it causes Delphin a lot of pain.
Onto the asphalt.
And then they get back in the ring and Sasuke does two different Cape Ranas that look like the easiest thing that's ever been done before. And it's that little 30 seconds of the match is like, oh man, that really represents what this is Delphin's great. Sasuke has his moments, but man, Sasuke annoyed me in this match. I just could never figure out what tone he was looking to play as this heroic babyface. Was it going to be a thing where, he has the Iwate crowd behind him to such a degree that leg injury that he shakes off completely and he can just go from there? Or is this one of those things that he's going to have to sell? He never seems to make up his mind. We instead just get this weird in-between with Sasuke where some spots are deadly, some spots are not, and as a result, it's just shy of a notebook match for me, even if I recognize structurally it is a really, really good match.
You see, this match was notebook for me.
That's cool, but I think it is for most people. I think this is, if you ask somebody about Michinoku Pro in 1993, this is undoubtedly the match that they go to. And again, I would go 3 3/4. I thought it was very good, but there were too many flaws for me to look past for it to be a 4-star match for me.
That's fair. I guess for me, and the whole thing with Sasuke's inconsistent leg selling, it was not that it didn't bother me. I felt like it kind of played into this overwhelming theme that we have seen over the first 4 months of the promotion, and especially in this match, that Super Delphin feels like he's not of this earth. He is very much... I think that there are some similarities between 1993 heel Super Delphin and 2025 Shun Skywalker in their characterisms. I feel like maybe not towards the point of hysteria that Shun does, but I do feel like that Delphin does embody this. I'm Super Delphin. I am the world champion here, and you are not. You're not worthy of this. Whereas Sasuke is like deeply human. He's trying to work through this leg, and all he's able to really do, and the thing that has been successful for him, has been essentially slinging his body at this wrestling god who is just getting more and more indignant as Sasuke doesn't go down. Sasuke fights out of the Delphin clutch, which kind of becomes a trademark in these series of matches that Delphin does the swinging DDT, but he's not able to do his insulting pen. And it just seems to like really piss him off even more. And I think all of that like adding into each other, and really the idea of Delphin being of this other plane and Sasuke just trying in his humanity to face a god really played off for me in this match. And it kind of let me get over some of the selling inconsistencies that you had.
The late great Dean from DVDVR describes Delphin in this era as Lucharesu Ric Flair in 1986. And that has always stuck with me, that he is kind of as close to an NWA champion doing Lucharesu as we've ever seen.
Yeah, an NWA champion that thinks that he's really above all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which would be the Flair component of that. I mean, look, Delphin's incredible. Delphin's incredible really from 1991. I always highlight there's that November 14th, 1991 match that is Hamada and Masa Michinoku, who was Sasuke, and Monkey Magic Wakita, who was Delphin, against Tejano, Silver King, and Dr. Wagner Jr. And I think that, from the footage that I've seen, is the first great Lucharesu trios match that exists, because it's something entirely different from UWA Mexico style, and it's something entirely different from, say, the great All Japan six-mans of that day. That match represents what we would see in Michinoku and Toryumon and Dragon Gate and so on and so forth. Delphin is really good from that point onwards, and especially in, the footage we have of 1993 Universal, Hamada has some really good matches, at that point, as his promotion is kind of crumbling from underneath him. But Delphin is the star of that promotion, and it's Delphin's charisma that shines through more than anything. So to see him come into Michinoku Pro, immediately be booked in this way, where he has a point and he has a point of view and he's this outlandish character, it all works so well. And yeah, I mean, look, this is a very, very good match that a lot of people think is a great match. So credit to them. Up to this point, the best match I've seen in Michinoku Pro, even if I don't have it as a notebook match.
Yeah, and a fun little tidbit about the post-match. Guess who we get to see in the ring celebrating with great Sasuke for the first time on Michinoku Pro footage, Case?
Who's that?
It's our main man, Masato Yakashiji.
I was going to surprise you because he's a referee on the H24 show. I was going to see if you recognize that or not. I'm sorry. He's a referee on this show. He's the referee in the what match is it? I've got it in my notes somewhere. Where is Yakashiji?
Was it the Sato match? He was not the referee in the Shinzaki and Delphin matches.
No, he is the referee in the opening match on this show. Nanawa versus Shiryu. So yes, if you go back and watch that, Yakashiji is the referee there, and then you can see him celebrating in the ring with Sasuke after the main event. Which again, I'll say this about the main event. It does feel epic, and it does feel like that is one thing that Sasuke and Delphin in particular, no matter the health of their bodies throughout the 90s, 21st century is a different argument, but if you needed an epic from Sasuke, he could will himself to get there. If you needed an epic from Delphin, he could will himself to get there, and I've always been very impressed by that.
Yeah, and I think we already get the sense of Michinoku Pro spectacle, even just between the two of them, that kind of becomes really refined over the next few years.
That's right. So we move on from July 24th. We'll wrap this up here in just a second. This pertains to the next episode of those days, but on July 26, 1993, there is an announcement made that Atsushi Onita and Great Sasuke made a joint announcement that FMW and Michinoku Pro would be joining forces on a limited basis, and that the Michinoku wrestlers would appear on the 822 Stadium show. Sasuke and other Michinoku Pro wrestlers worked the last FMW Stadium show on 5/5 as well. In exchange, Atsushi Onita will work the September 28th date for Michinoku Pro. That does happen. We'll talk about that next episode. Dave also notes here, and this is so funny to me, in the Mexico section of this July 26th Observer, Gran Hamada, 42, has been talking of retiring.
He would have his last match 25 years later.
But again, I talked about this when Hamada passed. He ran out of promotions, and if it wasn't going to be Michinoku Pro or New Japan, who luckily takes him back in 94, he would have retired because the landscape at that point was not very Hamada friendly. Dave notes in the August 9th Wrestling Observer that the match for the FMW Stadium show would be Sasuke, Taka Michinoku, and Battle Ranger versus Jinsei, Shinzaki, Grand Nanawa, and Super Delphin. Mike, let's go ahead and talk about that match now.
Yeah, let's just
once again, it exists, in clip form and then a full handheld version. Did you watch both for this match as well?
I just watched the handheld for this one.
Okay, cool. Because I just watched the commercial release of it, and it's kind of the same match as the last one, but you can see that Taka and Nanawa and Shinzaki are now worthy of being on a show this big.
Right. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the key point of that. You only had Delphin and Sasuke the first time amongst other luchadors. This time they feel more comfortable to have them here. And funny for us talking about, like, we don't really get Delphin core trios with this. You do get this here on that promotional show, which at least at this point you kind of now have a match you could send as a traveling match with like heels versus the Babyface Army.
That's right. That's a good point. So unfortunately, that really only lives on that FMW show, but you do get a glimpse into what it would look like there. Also on that August 9th Observer, we get Dave's note that Wellington Wilkins Jr., a former Minneapolis native who is now living full-time in Japan and has a regular job there, hooked up with Michinoku Pro, and also that Los Angeles indie wrestlers Piletto Suicida, Superboy, and Mercutio would debut next week for Michinoku Pro. I will go ahead and read from Superboy's Lucha Wiki entry, in which, and I assume this would be Cubs writing this, but that Superboy, his first claim to fame in stardom was when in July of 1993, he was contacted by Great Sasuke's Michinoku Pro of Japan. Wally Yamaguchi, who back then was helping book Michinoku Pro, contacted Dave Meltzer, so he'd recommend him a few lucha-style wrestlers from the area, meaning Los Angeles. Meltzer gave him the phone number of local wrestler Vandal Drummond, in parentheses Kurt Brown, and through him, Superboy got booked for his first Japan tour alongside Piletto Suicida and Mercutio. When Superboy was told about this, he thought this was a prank by one of the boys, as in the past, none of the locals had ever had the opportunity to go to Japan, and that almost cost him the tour because he didn't work on his passport and other documents until the last minute. A month later, he wrestled for Sasuke, and everybody at the office was so surprised with his awesome ability to fly considering his body size that from then on he returned more than a dozen times.
Yeah, no, Superboy, brand new figure to me, became a big fan on that studio show.
Okay, that's awesome because he is one of the guys I have earmarked here as, your Deans and your Rob Nailers and Alan, all these people have poured over Michinoku Pro footage. I'm not necessarily expecting to uncover a bunch of hidden gems, but if I'm going to, it's going to be through guys like Superboy and Piletto Suicida, less so than maybe a great Dick Togo match or a great, Sasuke match that nobody has seen before. So I'm glad Superboy jumped out to you. We'll talk about him in just a second because the only other note that I have is in the August 23, 1993 Observer newsletter. Dave writes that Michinoku Pro will be starting a monthly live television show on JCTV, which is Tokyo Cable. The show will be much different than any other Japanese TV show in that it will be patterned after Memphis and Monday Night Raw, with lots of angles, run-ins, screw job finishes, and lots of American-style interviews, and even a heel manager, Mr. Toyota, in parentheses, Wally Yamaguchi. This is the only one of these they ever run. I asked Dave if he knew why they did this, if he knew the story behind it. Dave said he did not know, but we do have this bizarre footnote in Michinoku Pro history, this studio taping from August 24th, 1993.
Yeah, and the version that we have comes from what I assume at the time was taped off of Japanese cable TV case.
Yeah,
Did you like those? Did you like those fun little like commercial breaks that were just kind of just lo-fi beats?
They were very long.
and they were
very long.
Yeah, and they were just like showing like Osaka, like that's what they were showing because there was the famous Dota. I'm gonna mispronounce this. Data Nobri.
I can't help you. So
you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
The Yakuza fans, it's the bridge whenever you go to Osaka. Yeah, that bridge that they had in these things. But yeah, let's just get into this acid trip. It starts with Separados playing and Sasuke lip syncing. And worth noting, I made a joke about this when I was watching through the show. If you're a Dragon System fan and you're really bummed about never hearing Separados, go and watch Michinoku Pro because Sasuke is still in all of a sight and comes out to his entrance and actually records a cover of Separados too. But then the guys from Champ Forum interrupt him, and you get to meet Dr. Lucha and Kaoru, who will be our commentary team. We go to that first interstitial, and we come back to our first promo. Wellington Wilkins Jr. has just this wild promo that talks about his body being a temple, and then you should refer to him as Mr. Squeeze as he chokes someone out, which case that brings us to another point match, Wellington Wilkins Jr. versus Naohiro Hoshikawa. Wilkins wins in 10 minutes with 8 points, and they make a big deal on commentary about him being called Mr. Squeeze.
Yeah, I did not like this. I think you're higher on it than me, given
God, I hate it.
You would say that again?
I have no place. This is not going to be a surprise. I think the more rules you put into pro wrestling and try to change the kind of the match, you're actually putting more handcuffs on you, and it usually comes off really poorly like this.
Yeah, I mean, look, Hoshikawa is somebody who I look forward to watching more of because
he's such a tragic figure too.
Yeah. I mean, he's absolutely incredible, later on in his career, but I think he's even got some high points in Michinoku, and I understand what they're trying to do here. Wilkins has a shoot background. He's UWF 2.0 guy. Hoshikawa is a young boy. I understand the story of wrestling and what they're trying to do with it, but to watch a guy lose 8 straight falls in a 10-minute match is by no means entertaining. And Wilkins Jr. is off to a rough start, if you ask me.
Yep, no, I'm with you. And just like putting this in the wrapper that this was like a pilot taping, this would not be the first match I would have on my brand new studio wrestling show that's never been done before in Japan.
I would agree with that.
This would not be what I would be starting the show. However, we get the Grand Nanawa interstitial where he's being very proud of being from Osaka. Then an interview with Shiryu, Mercurio, and Leopardo Negro. And we get our first real, I would say, a trios match that you would kind of recognize as kind of the start of a thing. With Jiryu, Taka Michinoku, Terry Boy versus Leopardo Negro, Mercurio, and Shiryu. The Leopardo Negro miscommunication leads the Luchador team to get rolled up as Terry Boy gets him with a rolling cradle pin on Shiryu. The two of them then come to blows. Nanawa tries to stop them. Then they beat up Nanawa, and then they come to blows again.
So Mercurio is this incredible Los Angeles-based luchador who wrestles 2 matches for Michinoku Pro, I think 2 matches for AAA, 2 of the Los Angeles shows from 1993. And then looking at his cage match, does nothing else of note, nothing that could be seen. And I'm devastated by this because I loved this guy. And I went to cage match going okay, how much more Mercurio do we have? Oh, nothing. This was the last time he worked Michinoku Pro. Awesome.
Yeah, instead you see a different Mercurio who is a mini star in CMLL whenever you try to look for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, he does not stick around, but I thought he was awesome as sort of an oversized, not in terms of weight, but in terms of height. Yeah, just an oversized luchador who really made Taka and Terry Boy look awesome. And you're exactly right. This is sort of the first thing we have that traces to what would be the Michinoku Pro Trios match that we would all come to know and love. It starts with this.
Yeah, and I think Mercurio actually ends up being the star of this match.
I agree.
That makes it the shame because you're able to have someone like Jiryu, who I did not really come impressed. He's really undersized, and he's undersized in a manner that Mercurio, basing for some of his arm drags, really felt like he was just spinning him around and then doing a front roll out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But Mercurio was a lot of fun. Terry Boy remains one of the more fun presents in this studio show. You get more involved entrances, so you get him coming out to Texas Bronco, which just rocks with that. And it just was a fun trios match, and you already get to kind of see this little bit of a split between the babyface side with Leopardo Negro, who we have not seen in footage for a little bit. Kind of immediately, he has a new mask now. He's doing now more direct Tiger Mask thing. I was wrong. It wasn't Black Tiger. He's just doing Tiger Mask.
Yeah, I think Sasuke comes from an era which every kid liked Tiger Mask, and he has his own promotion and said, go do our Tiger Mask. And boy, am I glad, because I like I said in the last episode, Leopardo Negro jumped out to me as I had no idea he was this good.
Yeah, and if there was going to be a tag pairing of him and Mercurio going forward, I would be all about it. What'd you think of the post match of Nanawa just kind of getting his ass kicked nonstop?
It was odd. It very much felt like, if you view this through the context of this is a pilot program. This is something they were going to see how this worked. This feels like trial and error that maybe was more on the side of error in execution.
Right. Then we get to the backstage aspects. They kind of get into it backstage. We get another commercial. I'm going to try it again. Dotonbori. There we go. Dotonbori Bridge. Mr. Toyota and Jinsei Sensaki backstage. And then we get Jinsei Sensaki versus Akihiro Yoneyama and the debut of Masato Yakashiji. 2-on-1 match. And Jinsei Sensaki just murders the two of them, finishing the match with a choke slam of Yakashiji over the top rope onto Yoneyama. And then they finish this off with Toyota doing a really ugly double stomp onto Yoneyama off the top rope through a steel chair.
And I like that, Wally is just such an odd looking, small, frail individual that he kind of has the perfect body type for a pro wrestling manager, because you can throw him around and move him around with such ease. And then when he does any sort of offense, it just looks so bizarre. It doesn't look like a wrestler doing wrestling moves. It looks like a guy doing wrestling moves. And I actually think that plays into the success of this character group together.
Yeah, I think so. And like the idea that at least you have Jinsei Sensaki, who is supernatural, and Toyota like has the face paint on. I don't know the reference he's trying to make with that, but it kind of all blends together in its own way, where he can kind of be like the spiritual presence to Shinzaki, but then ends up being just the obnoxious manager for Delphin. And from there, we get our in-ring debut of Superboy as he teams with Grand Nanawa versus Saito and Piloto Suicida, who turns out to be Mercurio's brother, Case.
Oh, okay. That's interesting, because Piloto Suicida, he sticks around. He's a Michinoku Pro mainstay through 96, works Mass League at some point down the road, but I did not realize they were brothers. That's too bad. I would have liked to have seen his brother more, but hey, Mike, this match is fantastic.
It rules. Superboy just like is a bouncy ball in the ring for a guy of his size. Like, I know he gets much bigger over time, but he is like a pudgy boy, and just the way that he's willing to interact with Nanawa really kind of gets you to a point where you're like, okay, this is kind of how the heel relationships kind of work. And just the work with him and Piloto were just exceptional in this. The Technicos get the win with a double Hurricane Rana, and it's just a absolute blast of a semi-main for them.
When you look at Michinoku Pro in 1993 and the wrestlers that are fully formed by the end of the year and the ones that aren't, Taka Michinoku would go on to be great, but he's not what he was in 1993. I think the same could be said for Grand Nanawa. I think the same could be said for Shiryo. It's amazing watching Sato, all caps Sato, Sato, who becomes Dick Togo. He's not on the debut tour. I believe he had a broken foot. He's not even on that June show.
Right. He does commentary on that June show.
That's right. So he does commentary on that June show. He's around. He's going to be a part of the roster, but he's got a broken foot. So he comes back in July, and he has the match with Taka, which is fine. But you see him here in August, and it is already so clear that Dick Togo is the best wrestler on the Michinoku Pro roster. And again, that's with Super Delphin being fantastic, and that's with Jinsei Shinzaki having charm, and Terry Boy doing what might end up being the best work of his career, and even Sasuke with the charisma that he has. In the ring, bell to bell, nobody is on Sato's level as soon as he steps foot into a Michinoku ring. And what I'm curious about going forward is, Togo works from 1993 to when he leaves in 1998. I am curious if there's ever going to be a point in time in which Togo is not the best wrestler on the roster, because I could see Togo just being that undisputed linear work rate champion up through the time that he leaves. I'm really curious to see if that changes. But look, this is a great match, and it's a great match because Sato and Superboy, who are 2/3 of the all-time fat guy luchador trio, Sato, Superboy, and Super Astro, all kind of having this kindred spirit. But Sato and Superboy together, I mean, my God, Mike, they're so good together.
Yeah, just instant chemistry. Superboy just, again, like, he, for a guy of his size, he bumps like he is 2002 Dragon Kid.
Mm-hmm.
He just doing gnarly stuff. Like, before even the match starts, he decides to take a turnbuckle to apron bump just because. And he is just such a presence and working in a way that I, I I guess the one person I would put up as like the counter to Sato always being the work rate champ would be if Hamada is there on tour at that time. But
Okay.
but I think
That's a fair. Yeah.
I think I largely co-signed just because at least within like these first two appearances, and I was a little bit higher on the Taka match, but it still was held back because of Taka at that level. He's complete. I feel like that you take him and you put him in the ring with anyone on that roster. I mean, Nanawa at this point has only been working in that gimmick for 2 months, if that. I mean, really, it starts at Mockland, and I know that they might have been testing him out with it on some of the other shows, but he is still like so green in this. But Sato is able to kind of like settle him down, and in some ways, even though he ends up kind of becoming the bigger mainstay, Piloto Siosita kind of is the guy who drifts in the shadows in this, and he was still really good in it as well.
Yeah, I still liked him. You know, it's hard to take up space and be memorable when you've got two forces like Sato and Superboy in the ring with one another. There's the spot in this match. Sato hits Superboy with like 4 drop kicks in a row, and after each drop kick, Superboy just
He bounces off the ropes, yeah.
but he like bumps off the ropes. Like it's not like he bounces off the ropes in a way that looks like, oh, he's no selling that. Like Sato's gonna have to hit him again. He's like doing bumps off of the ropes and then coming back to the middle of the ring and getting hit with another drop kick. And that's the sort of thing that, like, it just makes me sad because you could do that spot today on TV and I think people would lose their minds for it. And we've just lost. I don't know if camp is the right word because I hate when wrestling gets goofy, but this wasn't goofy. This was just the mechanics of pro wrestling working in your favor, and no one is doing anything like this anymore.
No, I think like that's kind of one of those fun things that we're getting to explore. I mean, when we did our Greatest Wrestler Ever shows with Alan Forel as part of Pro Wrestling Paradise, it became kind of like my big exposure to Yakashiji and going like, wow, this is a guy that works completely different than anyone else. And instead of watching kind of the same pro wrestlers as a wrestler in training, if you're trying to kind of work that kind of style, why would you not watch some Yakashiji along with your Rey Mysterio, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, especially like we're in this like great era, at least of 2025, that I feel like that for like 15 years, and maybe it started changing with people like Elgin on the indies, there were not necessarily that many thick boys out there. And the idea of just like beefy, almost super heavyweight, of course, Brian Cage kind of comes along, puts his own spin on that. But this guy kind of was doing and acting and working in a similar way that you could trace a line to like him and Powerhouse Hobbs. And it's just like, oh, maybe if you are a guy of that size and you're working that kind of style, maybe look at some Superboy stuff as well to kind of put a spin on things, just because he approaches working in that kind of style completely differently than anyone else since then.
Yeah, we're missing in wrestling right now, not to sound like a fucking Sagu Nakata writer, but we're missing like Chris Farley types of lovable fat guys.
Right, absolutely.
I don't know if I want Powerhouse Hobbs being Superboy, but my big complaint with like Keith Lee, I was out on that so early. Keith Lee drove me nuts because
I was out after Evolve with him.
Yeah. Oh my God. Exactly. I mean, I found the Lee Dijak matches in PWG to be so regressive because it was the most boring version of those matches they could possibly have. And I was so disappointed by them because to have that amount of size and to just continuously do these tired super indie spots, I never understood it. And I don't know if Keith Lee is the example of, man, he should be more like Superboy. I just don't know if those guys are in wrestling right now. I don't know if guys with those body types that could become the spiritual successor. And that's, I don't know what that is. I don't know why that's gone away, but you think
would Puff or like Dick Justice kind of be like the last of the dying breed of that?
I mean, fuck, I hope not.
I mean, like I've been racking my brain thinking like who would be that if it's not like your Keith Lee types, and those are like the only kind of presences with that. But when was the last time you've seen either of them work and actually be good at it?
The fact that I saw either of them work to begin with is the problem. You
True,
know,
yeah.
I mean, is there a bigger boil on this industry than Dick Justice? That wasn't funny once, and boy did he stick around for a while. And then, you know, as those AIW guys did, they were all so annoying and so uppity on Twitter the second that promotion got any momentum. But I digress. You know,
but they sold so many tickets at White Eagle Lounge. You know, I mean, come on, we have to sell more tickets for this show that we have to put on here.
These fucking guys, yeah. Anyways, we'll be in Vegas in a few weeks for WrestleMania weekend. But yeah,
I'll have the Ulti shirt. Come find me if you have issues.
Yeah. Me and Rich are gonna be. If you see Rich, I'm probably gonna be the guy with the mustache sitting next to him. And I'll be with Mike for the rest of the weekend. But Rich and I, as I was just detailing to my girlfriend, she didn't realize that I wasn't getting a hotel. That Rich and I are staying in an Airbnb. And I was like, yeah, it'll be great. Like, we can come home from all these wrestling shows and then we could do podcasts about them. And just the look in her eyes, just like, what the fuck have I done? Like, I'm hot. I don't have to be with this guy.
Bless our partners' hearts. My wife is going like, oh yeah, no, there's a pool at the hotel, right? Okay, go have fun.
Yeah, well, that was maybe I said this on VoiceKit already, but when I told Mackenzie, I was like, yeah, you know, because we've been together 2.5 years and she really wants to take a trip. And with my work schedule, it hasn't worked out. Financially, it stresses me out. But when I realized Dragon Gate was going to be in Vegas, I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. She's like, oh my God, that'll be so good. Like, I'll come with you. I thinking that I was going to be in Vegas Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, leave Saturday, and that I would be going to 1, maybe 2 wrestling shows the entire trip. And I kind of let her, she was like into it. And I finally started out and I go, look, there's 1 Wednesday, there's 2 Thursday, there might be 3 Friday. I got to fit in the Punk Rock Museum sometime, and I know you don't want to do that. And I just enjoy, again, just vanishing from her eyes. And she's like, oh, I guess this isn't an us trip. And I was like, no, I don't think it is. I think you'd have way more fun at home. So anyways, Mike and I will be in Vegas. AIW will not be there. But man, did they love sticking their nose in WrestleMania weekend for a while. And I hope to God that Dick Justice was not the spiritual successor to Superboy.
Yeah. I should put more respect on Superboy's name, as he's going to be someone in my heart for much longer.
Well, the good news with him is that he's not going anywhere. You know, he's a mainstay through the end of this project. You know, he works J Cup 2000, and if we get there, you'll see some Superboy.
Yeah. I mean, I know that the lack of Celestial / Black Man going forward, there's a little bit, but not a lot. So I need my pudgy luchador kind of quota. We then had even more Grand Nanawa backstage. This time he was eating as many frozen treats from Osaka as he could. And that led us to the main event of the JCTV pilot taping for the UWA World Welterweight title, the rematch from Mockland. Great Sasuke this time defending against Super Delphin. And before we get to the match itself, I just a couple notes here. As Mr. Toyota comes out, he is immediately handcuffed to the blue corner. Super Dolphin's pretty nonplussed by this, and more notably, at least for me and our Ken Oka heads, of course, Sasuke's theme, Separados. Super Dolphin's theme is Bad Communication by Bees, Ken Oka's theme, which works perfectly for this guy.
I had not put that together. Thank goodness you did.
That's what I'm here for. But the finish of the match ended up being a rope-slung German suplex, unseating Sasuke's UWA World Welter title reign. Dolphin gets back his belt, but this happens after a really prolonged head to Nabe bump. He sells it forever, giving time for a great Sasuke to emerge on one side of the ring, do a run-in, choke slam Sasuke, lay him out.
Jinsei Shinzaki.
Jinsei Shinzaki. My apologies.
Oh, good.
He runs in, he does the praying power bomb, and by that time, Dolphin is able to reemerge and get the win with the rope-slung German suplex. Did not like it as much as the Mockland match, but I think that was because we had kind of the spectacle of that here. But I feel like this is like as Memphis as it gets with a main event right here.
Yeah, you know, it's I don't know how you feel about it. I'm bummed we don't get more of these TV tapings.
It was so much fun.
Okay. It's so different. I wouldn't want this from All Japan. I wouldn't want this from New Japan, but I kind of want more of this from Michinoku Pro.
Right, and especially for like a young roster that are trying to like kind of define these characters. I mean, we're still within the first 2 months of Shinzaki as this character. Nanawa's brand new. Yakishiji just debuted. Saito is really now just getting cemented on the roster. Even having a little bit of those interstitials really help kind of define the characters, and we would have never known about Wellington Wilkins Jr.'s nickname of Mr. Squeeze if it was not for the studio taping, the backstage interviews.
Yeah, and like I said when we talked about 724, I think the 724 match is better at so many more things than this match. This match is kind of boring at the beginning of it.
It's really slow.
But this match also annoyed me less because we're not dealing with bipolar Sasuke in terms of, is he going to be immobile from this knee or is everything going to be fine? He works it more steady. There's an easier through line with all of this. So I found myself liking Sasuke more in this match, liking Delphin less, enjoying the vibe of this match because it was so different, but also recognizing that it just was not as good as 724 was.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the fair comparison. I mean, you're kind of doing apples and oranges in a way, whereas you have the vanquishing local hero in Marioka, and instead here you have kind of the overbooked heel angle that I feel like we would see get redefined so much over time. I did really kind of like the little character choice that Delphin just, as soon as Tanabe handcuffs Toyota to the corner, he just kind of occasionally, sometimes, like if he's not happy, he just goes over to that corner and is kind of conversing with Toyota. And I felt like that added a little bit to it, just that less that Delphin was kind of bothered by his ace in the hole not being able to help out here. But again, Delphin's just overwhelming egomania that is just like, okay, that's fine. I'm still going to go along with that. I enjoy that aspect of this.
I did too. Again, I really wish we saw more of this. I would have loved to have known what a second taping would have looked like and if they would have been able to follow up in this environment. But you see Sasuke get the big triumphant win in July, and then they immediately go back to Heat and Delphin getting the win in August. And I think that's a very interesting way of booking this promotion. So, when you look at Universal, no matter if it was the all-star luchadors in the beginning, the more integrated roster in 91 and 92, or the largely Michinoku Pro roster that just hadn't been Michinoku Pro yet in late 92 and early 93, the thing with Universal is there's not a ton of capital B booking. There's not a ton of angles. And that is primarily due to the fact that they're adhering to UWA Mexico's booking. And so it's much like Gabe and Dragon Gate USA. Gabe couldn't just turn Shingo heel or couldn't just turn Yamato heel. They had to stay true to what was going on in Japan. The exciting thing with Michinoku Pro is that from show one, they're like, we are doing angles, we're doing characters, we have heel units, there's going to be hate, there's going to be heat. And through August, it's really quite entertaining.
Yeah, and I think that going in this aspect and providing kind of the locality of having someone like Sasuke, that we will have a lot of Sasuke stories by the end of the series, but he's already positioned himself really well, at least within the Tohoku region, as this kind of local conquering hero. And we could say, yeah, how much of that is Wally Yamaguchi, like seeing like, oh, this could be something and hopping on it and the two of them working really well together? Yeah, that could be a level of that. But I think what we get to see, at least out of this first 5 month stretch, is going from, especially like, remember, like on the March 16th show, it was basically, okay, you had 4 matches of Battle Royal and then Luchador Tag. Like, it was not a coherent, real promotion. But by the time you have, and I do think these kind of shows work off of each other when we talk about Mockland and the cable taping. But between these two shows, I feel like we actually have a thesis for what Michinoku Pro will be like going forward. It just took a couple months of people, kind of getting up to the working standard and getting the pieces in play to finally kind of have it, and really ending the show with the Dolphin Corps celebrating the title. And now you have who is going to be the people who are going to be able to stop Delphin and Shinzaki. I think that it's a real compelling kind of storyline to go through as they enter their fall and their expanded relationship with FMW.
It's crazy how much Toryumon mirrors the start of this promotion 6 years later, you know, with the January Korakuen show is a big success because they have the big main event, but April and July 1999, those Toryumon tours are not great because there's not a ton to do yet. And then, by November of 99, it's like, okay, they kind of figured out what this promotion is. January 2000, M2K comes, everything changes. It's amazing how much these promotions mirror each other.
Yeah, and I feel like that if you want to look at like the thing, it is the introduction of the new heel unit, really. Because Dolphin Core, Dolphin kind of revealed himself as a heel by the end of the first show here, and similarly, Crazy Max was already a known entity, but when you introduce the Dolphin Core and when you introduce M2K, then you're adding in the elements that I think really can lead to the exponential growth that we see from these two promotions.
Mike, are you ready to preview what will be on Those Days episode 3?
Let's do.
Next time we talk to you guys about Michinoku Pro, Atsushi Onita comes to Michinoku Pro. Shiryu goes to Compton. Yes, Compton, California. And we close out Michinoku Pro's inaugural year as one of the most iconic feuds in the history of the promotion begins. That is all coming up on episode 3 of Those Days.
That's right. We can't wait to get into it. If you want to follow us as Open the Voice Gate on social media, we're on both Twitter and Blue Sky at Open Voice Gate. Case is at _InYourCase on Twitter. I'm at Fujiheya. If you would like to discuss more, we have the great Voices of Wrestling Discord, where there is a Dragon Gate channel and a miscellaneous Puro channel, which we'll see how much Michinoku Pro kind of comes in there as the series goes along. But most importantly, the Open the Voice Gate channel on the Voices of Wrestling Discord. That's where we will post our show listings, any other added notes. We had a great conversation after the first episode, Case, about how the populations in Tohoku are just so different from everything else in Japan. All that stuff can be found on the Voices of Wrestling Discord, and you can join the conversation there. But that's going to do it for this edition of Those Days. As Case said, next time we'll be back talking about FMW and Shiryu and Compton. Take care, everyone.
Hi, I'm Andrew Rich, and if you're like me, you look at the state of modern wrestling discourse and think, wow, what a cesspool. That's why I'm here to tell you about Music of the Mat Remix. That's right, your favorite wrestling music podcast is back with a new format, where I bring on a guest and we play songs related to wrestling-themed topics. It could be a wrestling reference, a wrestling concept, a wrestling pun, things of that nature. Now you might be saying, Andrew, that is a very, very tenuous connection to pro wrestling on a wrestling podcast network. Is this just an excuse to hang out with your friends and talk about music and ignore the rest of the wrestling landscape? Yes. Yes, it is. So listen to Music of the Mat Remix on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network, available on Apple, Spotify, or your podcast player of choice.